First up, I am Vatsalya Srivastava. I'm an assistant professor at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. For those of you who will end up in the program, I'll be teaching you courses like mathematics, statistics, applied economic analysis, a broad range of courses across your 3 years in the program. And the idea that, or the reason for which we are conducting this session is just to give you an idea of what it is to be studying economics at the university stage. And why I think this is important is that a lot of times the perception that you have of what the subject matter of a particular field is tends to be colored by the introduction that you have gotten to the subject matter at the school level. Now, because the introduction tends to be very specific and narrow in its definition of what, say, economics is, sometimes it is difficult to get a sense of what is it that you will be able to do once you go to a university and study economics for 3 years, and hopefully for many of you beyond that and go on and do a master's and so on. In my case, I've done my bachelor's from Delhi University 13, 14 years ago. I went on to do a master's in economics from Tilburg University. Then I did a second master's, which is a research master's also from Tilburg University, and I am a PhD candidate there at the moment. So what I want to be drawing your attention to today is, while of course there is a bunch of standard questions that economists are trained to respond to and answer and try to understand better, there's also many other types of questions that are very interesting and can be used or can be understood using the tools of economics, but are typically not talked about, particularly at the school level. So what tends to happen is that people who get interested in eventually studying economics, whichever the university they might end up choosing, tend to be people who are familiar with a few terms which are typically associated with economics, but not necessarily the broad array of things that you can do once you learn the toolkit and learn how to apply it. Now, because the objective here is to potentially give you some more information, stoke your interest in economics as a field of study, it'll be very useful if you can try to make this as interactive as possible, despite the limitations of the platform. Now, the limitation of the platform is that you cannot speak directly to me as attendees, but you can always drop in a word in the chat box, which you'll find here. And every once in a while, I will go to the chat box and check if I've gotten any suggestions, ideas, questions. This conversation will be a lot more interesting if I can help address your questions about the field and the subject. Because if I don't do that, what this becomes is a lecture. And while that has its uses at this early stage in your planning for what you should be studying, I think it's far more useful if we can have a conversation where I, as somebody who studied economics for many, many years, can potentially help you understand all the different kinds of things that you can do with it. So with that said, and with that caveat that I will be looking forward to your questions and suggestions and quick feedback, we will go ahead. So for now, we've been told, will you please share a recorded file of the session? I'll request the IT team. So the session's already being recorded. So this will be shared. This will be available. Whether it can be shared or not, that's something that I think the admissions team and the IT team can respond to better. So if they're listening in, they can respond to you. But yeah, thanks for raising that question, and we'll get a confirmation from them very soon.
Of course, yes. We'll be sharing the recorded session with the students for sure.
Excellent. So now we know that this will be available later. However, that shouldn't discourage you from sitting through the entire session. Right? So the idea still is to take your questions live as we go ahead. So I've titled the session, Who Wants to Be an Economist? And again, this is a play on the idea that sometimes our sense of who should be an economist and what it means to be studying economics tends to be very specific. So I'll give you a few examples. Somebody's raised their hand because there's, okay, so I'm not sure how raising hands works in this because I'm not sure that you can speak up, but feel free to drop in a line on the chat box, which I'll take a look at in a couple of minutes once I go through the first couple of slides. So what I want to start off with is typically the kind of questions people ask when they think of economics, right? Eventually, any field of study is driven by the questions that people are interested in. And once you have the questions, you want to have the ability to find potential answers to the questions. So here's just a general list of questions that many of you smart young people who must have been reading the newspapers over the last couple of years and might have come across these questions or might have thought of them by yourself. So here's the first example. So the growth of Indian economy slowed down, right? This is about over the last 3 or 4 years. It had been slowing down before the pandemic hit. Then the pandemic hit, and then it shrank. So we got these horrifying numbers of the second quarter of 2020, where we figured out that our GDP had shrunk by about 24%. But in recent times, it had started going up again. So by how much this slowdown happened, what do the numbers mean? What does it mean when somebody says minus 24% relative to say positive 20% this year? And why is any of this happening? Right? So this would be a typical question that you would think of when you're thinking of economics, because we tend to think of large aggregate numbers in terms of GDP and GDP growth rates and so on. Another one, something that many of us would have come across if you've been reading the newspapers recently, there was a data point that told us that approximately 121 million jobs have been lost during the pandemic. There was a time over the last 1.5 years when unemployment rate was the highest that it has been for the last 40 years. It was about 15%. And then as young people who are preparing to at some point enter the workforce, of course, you'll have questions like, which job should I be preparing for? Maybe because of the pandemic, the economy will structurally change and the type of jobs that will be available will be different from the type of jobs that were available before the pandemic. For people like me, of course, the question was, will I have a job? And I'm sure that that's a question that many of us have asked over the last year and a half, as sometimes things got really bad. For those of you who are slightly more technically interested, people who read the business page of the newspaper, you might have also read about the fact that the Reserve Bank of India had lowered interest rates. And more recently, you would have read that inflation is on the rise. So what are these interest rates that everybody keeps talking about? And if these interest rates go up or down, should I buy more or should I save more? If I should save more, where should I be putting my money? All of these are questions that people typically tend to think that economists address. For those of you who are more socially oriented, who are not only interested in metrics of the economy, you might have also observed that there has been a lot of conversation around the idea that the pandemic has exacerbated inequality in almost all countries across the world. Many of you might also remember the horrifying videos that we all saw of migrant workers who had to walk thousands of kilometers to get back to where they came from. Now, because inequality has become worse, should the government raise taxes? So should those of us who have survived the pandemic in a reasonably better shape, should we be willing to pay more taxes? Should we start donating more? Again, the idea here is to give you a sense of the type of questions that typically people think economists answer. So Ritvik has asked a question, are econometrics really driving economic policy making today? Part of it is, but remember that eventual policy making is part economics, part politics, part a bunch of other questions. So the economic part, yes, we collect a lot more data today than we used to earlier, and the quality of the data is much better. So is it only econometrics driving economic policy making? No, and I don't think that that can or should ever be the case. But it is far more important today than it was, say, even 10 years ago. So yeah, thanks for raising that. And then moving on, of course, the grand question that everybody is interested in, and this is basically following on from the question about public policy. All of us are concerned about so many things of the type that I've just mentioned. Can anything be done to address all of this, right? That's the real question that people think economists think about all the time. Now, before going on, I want to give you two quick quotes. Now, the attempt in the initial slide was to give you the typical questions that people think economists think about. And now I'm going to show you what two very famous people said. Both of them were economists, and they were trying to outline what the relevance of economics is in the world. So the first one is by a very famous economist called John Maynard Keynes. And he was not only an academic economist, he was also somebody who actually ran the finances of the British government during the Second World War to ensure that they don't go bankrupt. And he said, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. Now, this might sound like a confusing sentence, but essentially what John Maynard Keynes is saying, you can't help, even if you think that you're a very practical person, you only learn by doing, you don't really like to learn by looking at books, you can't help when operating in a modern economy but draw on the insights of economists who have looked at how the system operates and have come up with some interesting suggestions of what you can potentially do. And this is even true of people who otherwise think that their ideas or their positions have nothing to do with what expert economists are saying. Even they draw their ideas from some old academic economist who had worked in the area. And what this does is puts what we are going to be talking about in context. One of the most famous practitioners of the discipline is telling us, even if you think that this is just theoretical, this is not practical enough, many of the ideas that you would come up with by using the toolkit of economics are things that people will rely on, even if they don't quite know that they're relying on it. So here's a second quote. This is by another economist. This is Friedrich August von Hayek. He won the Nobel Prize, I think, in 1972. And he says that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. And what this quote does is tells you that this is a sophisticated area of study. So a lot of times you might come across people who mention common sense things, and many of them have become common sense because great economists earlier had figured it out. And now we think of it as just some general information that's available. But the systems that we are trying to understand when we are learning economics are very, very complicated. And we don't fully understand them well enough. So to presume that you can fix a problem by designing something new, until or unless you have spent the time and effort to really understand how these systems operate, that's not going to function. And it's the job of you, young economists who are trained in the subject, to keep on telling people that we still know very little, and we probably shouldn't try to fiddle around with things that we don't understand completely. With that said, having given you a sense of some questions and a sense of what famous economists have said, I now finally come down to the idea of what is economics. Now, why do I raise this question? I raise this question because I want to point to you the idea that economics is not all, or it is not only the type of questions that I have shown you earlier. So in my understanding, economics is a toolkit or a framework, right? So it's a framework because it allows us to understand some things, and it's a toolkit because just like any other toolkit, there's a bunch of different instruments that you can use to operate on different parts of the economy. And this toolkit or framework was first structured to understand how the economy functions. And the economy here means, in the modern context, look at a modern nation state. You put all the markets in the modern nation state together, and a market is simply a place, so it doesn't even have to be a physical place, right? It's just a place where there is some exchange of goods and services of any sort. You put all of that together, that is what we call the economy. And the toolkit that we have available to us today, which continues to evolve, was initially set up to understand how the economy functions. However, once the toolkit was developed, we started using that toolkit to understand a variety of different things. So just to give you a slightly different example. So David Carr, Joshua Angrist, and Guido Imbens won the Nobel Prize for Economics this year. And they won the Nobel Prize for their work on minimum wages and the impact that migrants have on a society when migrants come in. Now, for those of you, again, who are perceptive and keep up with the news, the question of what migrants do to a society is of great importance today. Right? So there's a conversation that the Americans have been having for a while, the Europeans have been struggling with, and we in India have also had in terms of migrants coming in from neighboring countries. They use the idea of something called natural experiments. So most of you are familiar with experiments as something that happens inside a laboratory. But when you're trying to understand society, you can't really put everyone inside a laboratory and try and figure out how things will happen. So you have to rely on things that already happen out in the world, and then try to develop an understanding of what actually happened. So natural experiment typically is that something was happening. There was some change in the rules in some part of the area, and in the other part, there was no change in the rules, and you can compare to check what the impact of the rule was. Now, again, we have already started diverging from what we typically think of economics as demand, supply, inflation, and interest rates. We are already getting into more intricate problems. And of course, these, because they won the Nobel Prize, we of course know that they were very advanced practitioners of economics. So what I'm essentially trying to get to is that economics is not just about GDP, inflation, unemployment, stock markets. That's what the economy is. And economics as a field of discipline was initially set up to understand the economy, but now we use it to understand a variety of other things. Take another example. Because we're all Indians here, we of course remember that Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and David Kramer won the Nobel Prize in Economics a couple of years ago. And their work sounds nothing like economics. Technically, their work is in the area of experimental economics, with the subject matter being development. But just to give you a flavor of the kind of questions that they were dealing with, so the first term that you see is Bal Sakhi. Bal Sakhi just literally translates to Bal means child, Sakhi means friend, so friend of a child. And what they were trying to understand is how do you improve educational outcomes in government schools in India? Now, we've all heard the arguments. There's problems of teacher absenteeism. There's problems of very low quality teachers. There's a problem of, so let's say, low interest levels in the administration to ensure that people get, or say young children get the best possible education. So they decided to check a small change. What they decided to do is that they went to these government schools, figured out where the students are coming from, and requested one young adult in the village to accompany students to and from the school. The idea was that what happens to your educational attainment and interest levels in students if you get a slight increase in adult supervision? And they found that it had a positive impact. Another question that they were interested in is how do you resolve the problem of malnutrition? So India has this huge problem where even as we are getting richer as a society, and we are not rich by any standards, but we are getting richer than what we were, despite getting richer, our malnutrition problems aren't going away. So they figured out that one of the things that they can probably try is, rather than telling people to eat more protein, they just would go to the ration shops and add protein powder to the flour that was given out from the ration shops. And the idea was that rather than expecting people to make changes in their food habits, that's very difficult and takes time, you take the choice away from them and simply give them more protein-rich flour. And that also led to reductions in malnutrition. The tool that Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee used to use are called randomized control trials. Now, this is a tool that was not developed by economists, it was developed by medical scientists. And this is what, so randomized control trials are what we rely on when we are testing any kind of medicine, including vaccines, and which is why some of you might have heard about randomized control trials. But Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo's great contribution was that they borrowed this tool from medicine and started using it to understand problems of development economics. Take another example. Richard Thaler in 2017 won the Nobel Prize for Behavioral Economics. And what Richard Thaler was doing was taking in insights from the field of psychology and using it to understand decision-making in an economic context. And his central thesis was that people often make poor choices. Our decision-making system in our heads is systematically biased. And because it is systematically biased, we know what kind of mistakes we typically tend to make. And he came up with this idea of nudges, that you can nudge people into making better decisions than what they would use, than what they would do if they were left to their own devices. Now, why am I telling you all of this? The idea is not to document all Nobel Prize winners in recent times. The idea is to give you a sense that if you're studying economics, you don't necessarily have to be only interested in things like GDP, inflation, unemployment, stock markets. Once you understand the toolkit, you can use the toolkit to ask almost any question that deals with decision making within a social context. And for that, I'll give you a much more specific example. So when I say much more, there are of course many researchers across the world who do all sorts of interesting work. I'll be focusing on this very simple idea of why and when do apologies work. Now, why I've taken this example is because this is one of my research papers. And my attempt was to try and understand how is it that in a society, almost everywhere in the world that you go to, everybody understands more or less what an apology means. Now, the term or the word that is used to convey the idea of an apology might be different, but almost every society in the world has the social concept of an apology, how it should be offered, how it should be taken, what you should be doing when you apologize, and so on and so forth. So how is it that the social concept becomes so widespread? And my trick was to understand or to try and uncover what fundamental problem is it solving. So I'll not show you the entire paper because it gets very technical. What I'll do instead is that I'll put it in the context of an even larger system. So one, I'm taking a social mechanism like an apology and trying to understand it. And I'm going to convey to you the idea that to understand a particular social norm or a social concept, it's best to look at it in a specific context. So the context that I have chosen is the context of religion. Now, that doesn't mean that I've all of a sudden become a theologian, that I talk about religion and try to understand what each religion says. I just use it as a context to try and motivate the reason for how an apology functions. And that will be my thesis for the next, let's say, 20 minutes or so. I'll not bore you with the details. I'll try to go through it rather quickly, where the idea is that within the construct of a religion, what problem does it solve? Once it tries to solve that problem, what new problem gets created, and how to resolve that potential problem. So with that said, before I move on to the next stage of this presentation, I'll quickly remind you of something. So this is another quote. This is by Alfred Marshall, another very, very famous modern day economist. And there's an old quote where he says that while mathematics is important for economics in terms of it should be a shorthand language to try and represent your ideas, if you're not very good at math, you should not rely on it when you're doing economics because you end up making many, many mistakes. That's the gist of the argument. However, here's what is important to remember. And I'll give you an example of this before I end my presentation to you today. In the modern day, if you want to be an economist, you need to work on your math. Mathematics is the language in which economists communicate with each other. So if you want to understand what they are trying to convey to each other, you must be able to follow it. Does that mean that you have to be a super smart, great mathematician? No. But it does require a certain level of familiarity with mathematics, which can be built with adequate effort put into it, even if you haven't liked it so far in school. In school, I think the problem sometimes is that you study math for math's perspective or for the sake of learning math. Here, that's not the objective. You will be learning mathematics. In fact, for those of you who end up in the program, I'll be teaching you your first course in mathematics. But the underlying idea will always be that so you are learning this language of mathematics so that you can understand economics. So there is a stronger motivator for this. And precisely for that reason, actually, in this program, we started something called the Mathematics and Statistics Camp that starts about 2 months before the program starts. And the idea is to get you in the frame of mind where you can start thinking about mathematics a little bit more before you join the actual program. So I wanted to give this caveat before I move on to the rest of the presentation. So before I explain to you why I have this picture up, I'll just quickly check if we've had any questions dropping in. And I haven't gotten any, so I'll quickly again encourage you to ask as many questions as you want, not just about this presentation, but if you have other questions about studying economics or studying economics, particularly at Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, please feel free to raise them. So why do I have this picture up? This is the Kumbh Mela. This is from the Kumbh Mela in Haridwar. And I call it the Grand because this is one of the largest congregations of people anywhere in the world. Now, if I could ask you a question, had you been in a classroom, I would have, but here, because I cannot ask you a direct question and expect a response, I'll give you the question and the answer. Why is it that I have the picture of the Kumbh Mela up immediately after talking about apologies? Because one of the beliefs is that if you turn up at a Kumbh Mela at this auspicious time when the Mela is held, and you enter the river Ganga, it washes away your sins. What is an apology? Something bad has happened, and you're trying to convince other people that what happened should be forgotten, we should move on. What is washing away of sins? There were bad things that I had done. Now I want to be absolved of those. So essentially, this is a representation of a large-scale religious apology in which a lot of people engage together. Now I can see, or I can understand if you don't understand the one-to-one relation between let's say the Kumbh Mela and an apology, but that is the idea. That is what I want to build towards eventually to try and explain. So this was a grand example. Here's a more mundane example. This is a picture of confessions. Essentially, people who talk to priests and tell them about things that they had done. And the idea is that by talking about it to someone else, you're essentially absolving yourself of the sin. So if you confess to it, you are likely to be better off than by not confessing to it. So this is something that happens on a more regular basis than say something like the Kumbh. There are also extreme examples. I don't have pictures of them up here because the pictures are too disturbing. But the example that I have in mind is the idea of self-flagellation. So I'm not sure how many of you understand the word flagellation. It's essentially you inflicting hurt or harm on yourself because you think that you have done something wrong. Now, what all of these three have in common is something wrong has happened, and you are trying to convince yourself, other people in your religious congregation, that I want to move on from it, and I have made the effort to convince everybody that whatever happened was not something that I wanted to happen. Now, within this context, we have to again ask the question, what does economics have anything to do with this? So here's the problem. All of these things, the kumbh, even confessions, self-flagellation, obviously, these are all rituals, but they're expensive. They're expensive either in the monetary way. So with the kumbh, there's a lot of money that you have to spend to go there, live there, and so on. They can have a psychological cost when you're confessing to someone about something that is not very pleasant. Of course, you're not in a very good frame of mind. And in the case of self-flagellation, of course, there are direct physical costs, which means all of these rituals use up scarce resources. Resources are scarce, right? So it's not that I have unlimited amount of money. It's not that I have unlimited psychological ability to bear psychological costs, or that I have unlimited physical strength that no amount of damage is caused. Even so, despite being costly and using up scarce resources, these rituals have survived the test of time, right? So they have survived for many thousands of years. So here's the problem. The problem is evolution inevitably punishes unnecessary extravagance. If you are spending resources, but are not getting anything in return, and that thing in return should be tangible and verifiable, it's very likely that over time, it would turn out to be evolutionarily costly. Either these rituals will disappear, or the religions that support these rituals will disappear, right? So that's something that we understand from the biological sciences, which means that if these rituals have survived the test of time, they're likely to have some functional purpose. It's very likely that they're solving a real problem in society. And that's my thesis. So just to give you an idea of how economists have thought about this in the past. So for instance, what could be this functional purpose? Why go through the trouble of such elaborate and costly rituals? One suggestion that again comes from economists. So this is not a theological argument. All the arguments that I'll be presenting to you today will be all economic arguments, which also means that if you study economics, you can also build arguments like these. One of the arguments was that religious communities are like clubs, right? So once you join a club, you get some special benefits, but to join a club, you have to pay an entry fee. And these rituals can sometimes be an entry fee to be able to enter a club and get the benefits of, let's say, being around people, helping each other out, and so on and so forth. I am more interested in the second stream of literature, which says that religions are pseudo-legal institutions. We call them pseudo simply because in today's day and age, in very few countries do religions actually prescribe what the law should be. In some they do. So you can think of them as legal institutions or pseudo-legal institutions. Essentially, the idea is the same. That religions are or one of the functions that they serve is that they solve problems that otherwise would have required a legal system to resolve. And rituals in this context are used to solve enforcement problems. I give the example of ordeals because there's a very wonderful paper on ordeals trying to explore this idea. For anybody who's interested, go to JSTOR, type in ordeals, and you'll get the paper. It's about witches and burning at the stake in medieval Europe. So for those of you who are interested in economics or history, it's a fun read. So before I go into what or how I think, or a very simple introduction to how religion can serve as a pseudo-legal institution, here's a quick idea. Afterlife utility. Utility is a term that economists use all the time. It just means that you get some happiness or fulfillment from something. Afterlife, of course, means that something that happens to you after your existence in the physical or the material world has ended. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the idea of the afterlife. In fact, you're likely to be very familiar because it's been an extraordinarily persistent idea through religious history. Almost all across the world, in almost every religion that we have ever come up with as humans, there has been some idea of the afterlife. Now, of course, there could be other reasons for it. There are religious reasons. I'm sure there are psychological reasons. I'm not interested in those. I am an economist. I'm interested in the functional economic purpose of this. So this is a quick introduction. I'll not go through this all because I think most of you are familiar with this. The idea of the afterlife is what happens to you after you die here. And there are typically two kinds of afterlife. There is heaven, which is great. There's hell, that's not so great. And the idea is that if you do good things in life, you end up in heaven. And if you do bad things, you end up in hell. In fact, typically in almost most religions, bad things have a trigger effect. So I could have been a nice person all my life, but if I killed a cat today, I'm still deemed to go to hell. Right? So that is the basic idea that I want to posit. What this results in is a carrot and stick incentive structure, right? So if I can call something a good action, which means that if you engage in it, you will go to heaven, I will encourage people to engage in that action. But if I call something bad, because if you do that, you'll end up in hell, it's less likely that people will perform those actions, right? So that is how you change incentive structures to get people to do certain kinds of things. So here's a quick example. Let's say there's a public good, right? So think of a 1,000-year-old village. Everybody wants there to be a well in the village, because if there is a well, there's supply of water, you can get drinking water, everybody's better off. Now, if everybody helps to dig the well, everybody's well off, right? So everybody has to put in less effort individually, but everybody gets the water from it eventually. But in every such public good situation, there's a problem that arises, which is a free riding. You're all young students, you understand the problem of group assignments, right? So what's the problem in a group assignment? Everybody wants the great or wonderful grade at the end, but while you're actually working on the assignment, nobody wants to work on it. So what is ideal for me? What is ideal for me is that if everybody else in my group does the work and I get the grade along with them. Similarly, with the village well, what is ideal for any person in the village is that everybody else in the village digs the well, but then this person can go and take the water. So this is free riding. Somebody else does the work, but you get something for free. The problem is this incentive exists for everyone. So for everyone in the village, the ideal thing is somebody else digs and I get the water. Typically, how we frame this result or this free riding problem is that eventually no work gets done. So there is no village well. So nobody had to put in any effort, but nobody got any water. Now, of course, we know that villages have wells and have had them for many thousands of years, which means that this free riding incentive or problem must have been solved using some sort of incentive mechanism. And here we get back to our afterlife. If sufficiently large number of people believe in the afterlife for whatever reason, theological, psychological, could be others, the incentive to work or to dig a well can be strengthened. So let's say some religious authority comes out and says, if you dig a well, you're doing a good thing, which means you'll go to heaven if you do this. But if you don't help dig the well or you shirk, then that's a bad action, which means if you don't turn up to dig the well, you trigger the bad afterlife and now you're going to hell, which is a terrible thing. You don't want that to happen. The result here, great. We had a problem of free riding. We solved it by creating the structure of incentives using the afterlife. More people are likely to work. Everyone is better off. Problem solved, right? Well, in certain cases, yes. In fact, there was a study in 2006 by Barrow and McCleary where they collected data and they show that in a society where there's high belief in hell, the work ethic is better. So people tend to work harder. Right? So there's some evidence for what I'm saying. It's not just something that I've come up with myself. The thing is, no matter how good you think the incentive structure is, there are, of course, problems. And here's the problem. What if you fall sick on the day of digging the well? And let's say it's not sick, or you're not sick in a way that other people can verify. You have a headache or a backache that nobody can see or check. They just have to take your word for it. Or worse still, you did not get the message. When there was a village gathering and everybody was deciding the day on which they should be digging the well, maybe you were talking to a friend and you just did not figure out. They did not really have calendars back then, so nobody could send you an invite for the event. What happens is, bad afterlife is triggered due to shirking. You did not actually turn up to dig the well, but it's not as if that you did not want to turn up to dig for the well. Maybe you were sick, maybe you just did not have the message, but you will still get punished in this incentive structure. If you did not turn up, whatever the reason, you will get punished. And this is not just a question of unmerited punishment, right? The problem is belief in the entire incentive structure is undermined. Nobody, including people like me and you, would like to believe in a system that punishes people who are faultless, right? The idea is that if you create an incentive structure, then people doing good things should get good outcomes, and people doing bad things should get bad outcomes. But now, if people who wanted to be good, but due to some mistake or reason ended up doing bad things, if they get the bad outcome, people start suspecting that maybe the structure is not very well set up. And here's the real big problem. Because bad afterlife is triggered, once it is triggered, the incentive structure stops to work for me. Once I'm certain that I have to go to hell, why just stop at not digging the well? Maybe I should start killing cats and dogs in my neighborhood. And that's where the danger comes in. There was the problem of free riding. We created an incentive structure to solve it, and there's some empirical evidence to show that it does actually work. But in the absence of additional changes or additional features in this incentive structure is actually very problematic, because it would very quickly lead to a problem where, due to a mistake, a person is punished, and now the person doesn't care about the incentive structure. It just doesn't work again. So what do? We come up with an idea as a society of how to reset the trigger. And resetting the trigger simply means maybe something bad happened, but I should have the ability to, just because a bad thing happens once, to go back to a state where I'm not condemned to go to hell. And that idea is an apology. Whether it is done in a social context, in an interpersonal context, in a familial context, or in a religious context, the idea remains the same. You do something bad to your friend, and your friend says, I'm never going to talk to you again, right? So that's like the bad afterlife trigger. So what do? You apologize to reset that trigger. Let us be friends again. Let's go back to the situation when the bad outcome had not happened. So that's the basic idea. And we, of course, face these problems in our day-to-day lives. You unintentionally hurt someone, you fail to meet a commitment due to traffic, some exogenous reason. And the tool that is used most often is an apology. Now, typically you would say, why would an economist be interested in apology? Because we are interested in how is it that people end up cooperating in social settings, right? I'm interested in how villages can come together to make public goods. Now, I gave you the example of a village well, but I can give you a more contemporary example. I'm interested in how the world will come together to address some of the problems of greenhouse gas emissions. It's the same problem. You have free riders, right? So every country would want everybody else to reduce their emissions. And we need to come up with mechanisms of how to coordinate. And what I'm trying to get across is, if you want to come up with such mechanisms, you have to understand the pre-existing ones, including those like apology, where the attempt is to convince the offended party, whichever party suffered harm due to you, that the offense was not intentional, that it was due to a mistake. Now, in the religious context, obviously, as we've talked about, apologies are a way to reset the trigger, wash away your sins, a way for the faultless to avoid punishments. And more importantly, if the trigger can be reset, the incentive structure continues to work. If after not turning up to dig a well for one day, I'm not condemned to go to hell, maybe I should turn up to work tomorrow, because I still have a chance to end up in heaven as opposed to hell. But what are the problems with this, right? So remember, we started off with problem number 1, free riding, solution, incentives. Problem number 2, incentive structure is not ideal because sometimes bad outcomes can get triggered. We said the solution is apology. But now once you started talking about apologies, we have to realize what the problems there are. One is fake apologies. If I can apologize later, why not shirk deliberately? I'll just not turn up to dig the well, and tomorrow I'll find a way to apologize. Problem solved. But of course, that's not ideal for everybody else in the village. Problem number 2, how do you figure out how costly an apology should be for a given mistake, right? Is it something to do with how much harm I have caused? Is it something to do with what was the probability of the mistake? Is it something to do with how much I gained from it? Now, these are questions that can be set up in a formal theoretical economic model, which is what I had done in my paper, to try and address these questions, right? So we've already talked about in terms of what an apology is. So I'll tell you the 3 important characteristics, and then we'll move on to potentially something that some of you might be more interested in terms of its policy implications. 1, an apology is self-inflicted. So you remember when you were children, your parents would tell you, don't just say sorry, feel it, because feeling it is the cost that you impose on yourself. What is important is that this means that an apology cannot be met out by some authority. So if somebody screams at you, say sorry to me, everybody knows that that's not a real apology, and we don't take it too seriously. A sincere or a genuine apology has to be offered by the person who committed the mistake. So imagine what we're doing. To those of you who are interested in understanding incentive structures, when we have an external punishment, somebody who does not know as much is deciding whether a person should be punished or not. In an apology, the person who knows best, the person who did it, I know whether it was a mistake or not. I am the one who has to decide whether I should communicate the idea that it was a mistake or that it was not a mistake, right? So now we are putting the person who has more information about the situation in charge to figure out how to resolve the problem. So in that sense, it's better. An apology is also got to be costly. Just saying sorry does not cut it, right? So there's psychological costs, monetary costs, physical costs. And by now you must have realized that these are the three costs that we had talked about when I'd shown you the examples of Kumbh Mela, confession, and self-flagellation. And most of us would agree that when we want somebody to apologize sincerely or genuinely, we want them to undertake certain costs on their sense, undertake or incur certain costs. Now remember, them incurring a cost does not mean that we get paid. So it's not a compensation. It's just that we should feel that they have suffered in the process of making an apology. And the third one is that there has to be separation of intent and outcome, which means that there must be a possibility of a mistake. If I am convinced that there is no possibility of mistake in a particular context, no amount of apology works, right? So if you're certain that your friend did it deliberately and that there was no chance of mistake, that friend can apologize all they want, you will not take it seriously, right? So I'll not get into the theoretical details of this, but as I promised you that I'll show you some math ideas. So while all that I've talked to you right now was just in pure English, hopefully providing you logical arguments of what I was saying, when you start doing serious math, this is what you'll end up writing. So this is what the proofs of some of the claims that I've made so far look like. Now, again, I'm not going to get into the details of this. Where did I get all of these different letters from? But I just wanted to give you a feel for how important mathematics is, and that even if you want to understand something as commonplace as apology, or apologies, at least within an economic framework, you must have the ability to work with some math. And again, don't let this deter you. Let this be a motivation. If you want to do interesting stuff, you need to have the skills to be able to do them. And here, at least at JSGP, we try to help you as much as we can with the things like Math and Stats Bootcamp and so on and so forth. So, in fact, if I could quickly point out something else, if any one of you thought that the conversation that I was having about apologies was only some theoretical idea to talk about some obscure thing, that's what academics do, who cares? I'll tell you to think about two things. The number of cases that are pending in Indian courts. Once every year, a senior justice, typically the Chief Justice of India, will remind us that there are 30 million cases or 42 million cases which are pending in Indian courts. Remember what I said, many of these are pseudo-legal institutions. They're trying to do what a legal system does, but without the support of a formal legal framework. Now, before you dismiss apologies as just something that all of us do, and maybe some religions acknowledge it and so on, I'll encourage you to look at the example of Japan. In Japan, 33% of the cases that are filed before a court are dismissed by the prosecutor. Essentially, the government prosecutor refuses to take it forward if the person who has caused the harm or injury agrees to apologize. Now, there are a variety of reasons or systems that are put in place to try and figure out what a sincere apology is, but 33% of the cases are dismissed by prosecutors. Of the cases that go into courts, another 30 or 35% of the cases in which a person has been found guilty and convicted is dismissed by the judge if the convicted person agrees to apologize. This dramatically reduces the burden on the Japanese legal system. Now, if we are able to figure out how to quantify these questions, try to put them in a framework, and if it can work in Japan, where they're richer than us and probably have a court system that functions much better than us, it can also work in places like India. In fact, the whole idea of Lok Adalat was to leverage these social norms to be able to solve some problems, instead of every problem ending up in the courthouse with delays of years and years and years. So remember what John Maynard Keynes said? no matter how practical you think you are, or anyone thinks they are drawing on ideas from some economist's work somewhere. So maybe at the moment, the idea of apology is being worked upon rigorously with mathematical instruments might seem a little odd. Thing is, we're still trying to solve a real problem. And who knows, maybe in a couple of years' time, maybe in a decade's time, somebody figures out that, well, this defunct economist idea is actually useful and makes policies based on it. That was the idea here. Now, because I said that I'm going to be talking about who wants to be an economist, and the idea was to partly give you a sense of some of the things that many of you might not have thought economists do, things like apologies, religion, and so on and so forth. I'll end up with saying some things that people expect economists to be doing, right? And that's the end game. So if anybody says that they study something without caring about what they'll end up doing in their career, they haven't thought through what they're trying to do in life, right? So the idea is that you must have some idea. Of course, that is not exactly what will end up happening, but you do tend to have some vision of where you want to end up. So here's a quick overview of some of the areas or some of the fields in which the specific skills that economists have are valued. So one area is data. All of you would have heard these wonderful lines being thrown around today, that data is the oil of the modern world and so on. The reality is that in today's connected age, there is a lot of data, which means there's a lot of data to be analyzed. So people who can work with data, interpret it, are highly prized. Now, the specific part about collating data from technological platforms is something that computer people will, or computer engineers will do much better than an economist, unless as an economist, you train yourself in these softwares, which again is something that I would highly encourage anyone and everyone to do, is to develop basic coding skills as early as you can. However, once that data is in, how to analyze it to be able to get meaningful insights is something that anybody who studied economics and econometrics understands, and therefore their skills are valued in this area. There's this entire policy and consulting space. Of course, there are corporate and management consulting areas where economists have historically worked for many, many years. But a newer area, depending on what you're interested in, is this idea of government policy and development consulting. What has happened in India for the longest time. So for many, many years, if you're interested in policy in India or making policy, you either become a politician or you become a bureaucrat. That is it. However, increasingly, as the demands of the modern world have placed larger pressures on governments, governments have realized their own skill shortage or limitations in their ability to deal with a lot of new information coming in. So what has happened is that a lot of policy thinking and making has been outsourced, and they've been outsourced to exactly these government policy and development consultancies that have grown in rapid numbers over the last few years. So another area where economists are typically valued. Of course, then there is a field of finance. Finance was historically a subfield of economics, right? So you have economics, you have macroeconomics, microeconomics, econometrics, finance, labor economics, and so on. Lots of different subfields. Over the years, of course, it has become so important that even though technically it's a subfield, it has an entire literature on its own. But because it is a subfield, it still borrows most of the basic ideas from economics. And for anyone who's interested in checking this out, go online, find the CFA syllabus, and map it onto what you'll be studying in economics in your 3-year degree. And you'll see there is a lot of similarity, at least, in fact, mostly in the core ideas that finance builds on. Something very similar is also true of business and marketing. They're related fields. They're both historically subfields of economics, not so much anymore because they're very important in and of themselves, but they share much of the toolkit. In fact, because the level of sophistication in economics moves at a faster rate than business and marketing, typically, at least practitioners in this field, end up using tools that economists used to use, say, 5 to 10 years ago. Which means, again, if you are well trained, if you have developed yourself sufficiently, these are areas that your skills would be valued in. And I don't want to go into the specifics of what jobs and which jobs, but the idea is to give you a sense of some of the things that you can potentially do if you have studied economics. Okay, so with that, I think I'm done with what I had to say for today. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to address them. If not, then I really do hope that you got some insight into understanding how, after having studied economics, you're not necessarily limited to talking about things that are published on the business page of the newspaper, right? So you're not limited to talking about GDP, inflation, unemployment. Of course, you can talk about them, and that's what many economists do. But then there are also those who use the toolkit to try and take up, understand, let's say, less conventional questions. But because the toolkit is the same, once you know the toolkit, once you understand it, once you appreciate how it can be used, you can use it in a wide variety of different areas. And I hope that at least I was able to give you some flavor of how that can be done without getting lost into the details of mathematics and propositions and lemmas. So yes, I think we'll wait for another couple of minutes to see if there are any questions coming in. And if we don't get any over the next couple of minutes, I think we can end the session with my best wishes for the upcoming New Year celebrations. Although it's very likely that the New Year celebrations, or all of our New Year celebrations will be limited to our homes. Even so, it's a new year, so we can all hope that this year turns out to be better than the outgoing year, which I'm sure was difficult for everybody. Okay, so we have a question here. My question is, how does nations benefit from having an economically literate population? People tend to make better decisions. For instance, if you are aware of simple ideas of consumption and saving, you tend to manage your personal finances better. If every individual in a country managed their individual finances better, the overall situation in the country in terms of the savings rate of the country being high, such that those savings can be used to invest into capital infrastructure and so on, tends to be better. In terms of generally being more economically literate, so not just personal finance, but generally understand the economy better, at least in democratic countries, it's useful if the electorate can figure out what useful and meaningful policies are and which ones are not. Which means that they can hold their politicians to better account, which is obviously better. Can artificial intelligence come up with economic policy decisions? Sure, why not? Not yet, though. At some point, maybe, because there are so many complex systems that policies affect, that having sophisticated ways of being able to draw connections between these complex systems will, of course, be useful. However, economic policy is not always based on these connections. There's also historical information. There's also political expediency. You also have to build in the idea whether it will be acceptable or not. So I'm sure it can help. I mean, any increase in computing power helps in our ability to work with large amounts of information, for sure. The other question was demonetization a good decision? That's a policy question. In terms of what its stated purpose was, that it will get rid of black money, of course it didn't. In terms of some of the, let's say, unanticipated benefits, maybe there was some advantage to it because potentially more people moved onto online platforms to make their payment, which has held us in good state in the pandemic. But of course, in terms of the originally stated reason, yeah, I don't think it was particularly great. How does economic help an entrepreneur? So if you are an entrepreneur, eventually you're going to be entering a marketplace. If you understand how a marketplace operates, what are the dynamics of a marketplace is, you are in a better position to start even thinking about your entrepreneurial choices, right? So for instance, even basic economics will tell you that you can have the best product in the world, but if nobody is willing to buy it, or if there's no demand for it, you can barely charge any price for it. So it gives you a sense, helps you build your intuition about how a market operates. And therefore, in addition to all the other information you'll get, right? So as an entrepreneur, you understand what the relationship between macro level interest rates are, say the ones that RBI declares, and the rate at which you can raise money from the market. So yeah, having a good sense of how the economy operates obviously helps an entrepreneur in terms of which all specific areas it does in depends on what your specific entrepreneurial interest is. Is there any difference between BA economics and BSc economics? Typically, no. Historically, in the British system, so any country that follows the British system will have a BA degree in economics, Any country that follows the old German system will have a BSc degree in economics. As to what are the specific differences, that depends on which particular university you're talking about. In general, there isn't a difference. So for instance, if you look at Singapore, until recently, their degree in economics used to be called BSOSC, so Bachelor's in Social Science. So essentially, it's a question of what you want to call the particular. So do you want to call economics an art, which used to be the case in the old British system? Do you want to call it a science, which is true in Netherlands, Germany, and so on and so forth? Or do you want to call it a social science, which at least until recently was the case in Singapore? So I can give you my example. My first degree was a BA in economics from Delhi, and my second degree was an MSc in economics at Tilburg. So it was merely a change of nomenclature because different systems follow different traditions in terms of what they refer to economics as. Economics is often construed as a difficult subject due to its technicalities and lack of mainstream activities around it. How can the narratives around the curriculum be reimagined? Technicalities, yes. I think anything that's worth learning is difficult. So we can't get rid of the difficulty part. Its technicalities or its ability to deal with sophisticated questions in a sophisticated and precise manner is what makes it valuable. So that part I agree, and I think it should be retained. In terms of lack of mainstream activities around it, I'm not entirely certain what you mean. I can tell you what my position on how the curriculum can be reimagined is. I think when we were studying, and not when I think, when I was doing my bachelor's in economics, the biggest problem was we graduated with lots of information, lots of theories that we could talk about. But in my very first job, when I was asked what exactly I could do very little. I could share ideas about what I'd read, but I couldn't really solve a problem outside of a textbook problem. So in fact, one of the things that we did a couple of years ago, in fact, I did it we ensured that we included the idea of applied analysis into the program here at JSGP. So I teach second year students, so fourth semester students, I teach them a course which is called Applied Economic Analysis. And the entire objective of the course is I throw real life questions at you and leave it to you to try and figure out how is it that you would start addressing that question, given what you have studied in the first three semesters and what you continue to study in the other courses. So the idea there is, it's not that you get into the habit of solving problems that come up in textbooks. It's that you develop your ability to solve real life problems, and which is what makes you a valuable person once you enter the job market. So increasingly, I think all programs are moving in that direction. We have already made that change by including this and a few other courses. But yeah, that would be my position on this. You also mentioned mainstream activities such as hackathon, fests, quizzes, debates. So in general, if you're a debater and you don't, and so I was, say, a debater and a quizzer in college when I was doing my bachelor's. Now, I realized that studying economics always made it easier for me to formulate arguments because I had developed the ability and habit of breaking down an argument into its component parts and then trading off what is worth it and what is not worth it in almost every argument that I made. So it's likely that the debate topic will not be some direct economic question in terms of what should be the government policies for something. Let's say, how important is the stock market? But once you have the ability to make sophisticated arguments and the ability to understand the core nature of trade-offs. Yeah, I mean, these are derived skills, but something that you can consider when thinking about activities around economics. So you might not have as many direct questions. However, there's increasingly all of these mock stock exchanges and so on and so forth that are coming in. There are also simulation programs, policy simulation competitions that are happening that you might be interested in at some stage. Does JGU offer UG programs in pure economics or in combination with finance or management? The program that I'm talking to you about, or the one that I teach in, is a BA honors in economics, which means that for the first 2 years, you study largely core economic concepts, stuff that is useful also in finance and management. In the third year, you have option to take electives, which means that some of these electives you can take from, say, the School of Banking and Finance, which might have a dedicated finance elective offered to students. You can potentially also take a few courses from the School of Business, from the business school, which would of course have some management related courses. But the program itself is economics. You can supplement your economic information by taking electives in your third year from many other schools that we have on campus. Right, most universities in the US require 16 years of education for applying to the master's program. However, the candidates with a 3-year BA, BSc enter such universities for masters. Right, so yes, in the US system, they require 16 years for a master's program. Typically, that has been true for many, many years. In the last few years, that requirement has been relaxed. So many of our students, in fact, have moved to universities in the US for a master's. In fact, that's information that if you need, I'm sure you can write to the admissions office and they would have it. So that's one. Second, that's the nature of difference in education systems. So in fact, I can give you some more information on this. Historically, in social sciences or the art programs, American schools did not have a standalone master's program at all. So the idea was that if you have completed your 4 years of undergraduate education and now you want to move on to graduate studies, you would join a PhD program, which was 5 years long, where the first 2 years were the coursework. And then once you're done with the coursework, you engage in your research, which could be 3 years, but typically takes longer than 3 years. Standalone master's programs in art subjects, so MA in economics, is a very, very recent phenomenon. So when I started applying, I remember applying in 2008, and we of course have this 4-year problem. But even then we realized very quickly that only 2 universities, NYU and Boston University, had an MA program in economics, and that was it. It's only more recently that the numbers have gone up, and the numbers have gone up for the specific reason that they're looking for international students who are looking for a master's program. So there will be certain limitations when applying to the US. But I can tell you that students have gone there. But of course, I don't have an exhaustive list of which universities have changed their requirements going forward. In general, however, a master's in economics in a system that historically did not have a master's in economics is something that at least I personally would not recommend very highly. Can a student opt for a double major in economics and computer science in JSGP? No. So there are 2 different setups. So one is where you take this idea of majors and minors, which is again the American setup. But I think the Jindal School of Liberal Arts has a setup where you join a liberal arts program and then you can choose your majors and minors. So I'm not sure if the possibility for computer science and economics exists in the School of Liberal Arts. But the program in BA Honors Economics that we offer at JSGP is within the British system. So there are no major minors. You decide which program you join. And that is what you study, with the exception of electives where you can get additional things from around. Can one apply for master's program in the US after 3-year bachelor's course, or does it require additional year of curriculum? So that's something that I addressed extensively like 2 minutes ago in a question that was raised. In general, historically, you couldn't apply with a 3-year bachelor's to a master's program in the US, but increasingly there are quite a few universities that have relaxed this requirement. But that's again something that you'll have to look into by looking into individual universities and how they've changed their admission policies. What I can tell you is that we have had students going after a 3-year program to universities in the US. How does computer technology influence economics directly? It makes it easier for us to work with large data and complicated models, which are difficult to solve manually. In terms of data, it makes it possible for us to work with data sets that were beyond the imagination of any economics professor, say 10, 15 years ago. So it helps us get better insights and helps us solve more complicated models. So earlier, for instance, the trade-off was very straightforward. You could have a simple model that you could solve and make sense of, or you could have a complicated model that reflects reality more closely, but you can't solve it. As the ability of our computers increases, we can increasingly solve more and more complicated models, which means models that reflect the real world better than some of the older, more simple models. Okay, I think we're out of time. And I really do hope that you found some useful information in this session. And we'll be talking about this. And if we get feedback from you guys, if you liked it, write in the admissions office, let us know, because we can have more such sessions with different people bringing their own expertise to try and talk to you and just giving you a sense of what it means to be studying economics at the university level, both in terms of the functional aspects of it, in terms of where you can end up after you have done your bachelor's, and also in terms of giving you greater insights into what all fun stuff can you do with economics. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I look forward to more such sessions. Thanks a lot.